Good afternoon, and welcome to AIADA's AutoTalk. I'm your host, Rachel Soleimani. Before we get started, a few quick reminders as always. Anyone who has registered for today's program will be receiving a copy by early next week. And if you have any questions, be sure to enter them into the Q&A bar at the lower right-hand side of your interface. Today, we welcome Stephanie Valdez-Streety, Director of R&D at Cox Automotive. Stephanie, I know you have a lot to get to today, so I'll let you take it away.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here today. I look forward to talking about electrification. Just a little bit about myself. I work for Cox Automotive. I've been with the company a little over 10 years. And prior to Cox, I worked at Nissan, and I was there when the Nissan Leaf launched. So it's exciting to see how far the electric vehicle has come and where it's going. So for the next few minutes, we'll talk about some trends, talk about some knowledge that will be important as you prepare to sell EVs, and really give some specific examples. So with that, let's get started. So we're in this perfect storm. As I mentioned, I worked at Nissan when the Nissan Leaf launched. And back then in 2010, I remember the CEO was talking about aspirations of being, the leader in zero emissions. And that didn't come to fruition. And so why now? So we're in this perfect storm of environmental commitments. We have regulations. We have OEMs committing to electrify their fleets. Billions of dollars have been invested and committed over the next few years in the industry. And we're starting to see more and more information in the media about EVs. So consumers are becoming more educated and creating more awareness about EVs. However, as you probably see in the news, we have seen some bumps in the road, supply chain issues. We've all seen the chip shortage issues that have really impacted the automotive industry and other industries as well. We had the Ukraine war, which really impacted the price of nickel, caused a significant increase. So we've seen some increases in the price of batteries from last year because of these supply chain issues. And so I think there's a lot of things that we need to think about as we move through this electrification era. But the good thing is that, as I mentioned, there's billions of dollars being invested. And so, as you can see on this chart, there's 13 new gigafactories that are scheduled to launch in the US by 2025. And I think that's really going to help really provide a more resilient and sustainable infrastructure for the US. There's been some research done that by 2030, there will be 155 new gigafactory plants. And so I think for the US to compete in this market, it's going to be important that we continue to build out this supply chain. And then one of the positive, I think, outcomes of this is the jobs that will be created as well, both direct and indirect. And then on this chart, you can see that a lot of the gigafactories are going to be in the Southeast, there's some in the West, and then some in the Midwest. So we'll continue to see this continue to grow. We'll see the gigafactories become more operational efficient, and then hopefully over time that these will be powered by renewable energy. So we'll continue to see the environmental benefits of EVs. The other thing that's going to be critical for this electrification era is that we continue to build out this charging infrastructure. So in this chart, you can see that we have a little over 50,000 charging stations in the US. And from 20 to 21, there was a 60% growth. So we're starting to see a lot of acceleration with EV infrastructure. And on this map, you can see how they're distributed. And with the recent infrastructure bill, there's $7.5 billion that's going to be invested to increase this charging station infrastructure to about 500,000 more. And one of the critical things with that is making sure that those charging stations are in rural and underserved areas. And so we're going to start to see more and more of that. We also have utility companies partnering to build out infrastructure, as well as OEMs partnering with dealerships to build out local community infrastructure, which I think will continue to grow. But a few things to note on the charging infrastructure is that it's going to be critical that these charging stations are interoperable, meaning that in the future, no matter what EV you drive, you can charge at any charging station. The other thing will be that they are operable. There was a survey last year, a couple of years ago, out of San Francisco, And 1/3 of the respondents said that when they went to charge their vehicle, it wasn't operational. So I think we need to continue to figure out how do we make sure that these operational, accessible, and in the right place to really help meet consumer needs and make sure that consumers feel confident about the infrastructure that's in place when they buy their EV. And as I mentioned earlier, with all the buzz in the media, there's lots of information. So we're starting to see consumers becoming more interested in considering buying an EV. We saw in our recent study that there was a 37% increase from 38 to 52 in the percentage of consumers considering a pure battery electric vehicle within the next 12 months. And then a 76% increase from 21 to 37% in the percentage of consumers that are greater than 50% confident that their next vehicle will be a BEV. And then 33% increase, and that was 3 to 4% consumers that they're 100% confident that their next vehicle will be a battery electric vehicle. So definitely starting to see more consideration for EVs. And we've seen this in the sales data. So in this chart, you can see that it's expected by 2027 that there'll be 4 million vehicles in the sales projections. And last year, for the first time, we had 800,000 pure electric battery vehicles sold in the US. And it's expected by the end of this year, we'll reach 1 million vehicles for the first time. So the numbers seem small, but as we start to accelerate, those are going to quickly grow, especially when we see commitments from OEMs to electrify their fleet by 2035. And then even some states, California specifically, saying that by 2035, any new vehicle sold will be a pure battery electric vehicle. So I think these numbers are going to continue to grow, and it'll be interesting to see how much of an impact the things I talked about earlier, such as supply chain issues, could potentially delay some of these. Now let's move on to a little bit about what kind of knowledge will really be helpful to have when you're starting to prepare to sell EVs and you're starting to see more and more consumers come in and wanting to buy an EV. One of the things I like to point out first is just to kind of set the stage of how EVs and ICE vehicles differ. So you can see on this chart, vehicle cost structure is one of the key elements that differentiate them. For a powertrain, it's about 13% of the cost. For an EV, it's 37, up to sometimes 45, 50% of the cost. And so hopefully over time, as we get more and more in the car park and we see more innovation, that cost will continue to go down. The other area is vehicle valuation. The key driver is mileage, and there's well-known diagnostic capabilities around that. For values of EVs, it's really new, and it's all about battery health. And right now, there's minimal diagnostic capabilities to really understand that. In terms of salvage, ICE, it's well-established salvation network around that. For EVs, we're building that out, and I think that's part of some of the infrastructure bill is to provide this ecosystem that really help ensure that EVs are properly, especially the battery, properly recycled at the end of life. And then residual values, that's going to be key. Once again, for ICE, large depreciation data history. For EVs, minimal. And so I think that's something we'll start to see more and more of. How does the battery health impact the residual value of an EV? And then finally, especially for dealers, the service and diagnostics. For ICE, well-known schedules, widespread capabilities. For the EVs, it's going to, develop over time, especially as we need to figure out like, how does the technology evolve? What kind of skill sets or training or certification do technicians need to really understand and really maintain these EV batteries? So that's a high-level overview of some of the differences between the EV and the ICE. Now let's talk a little bit about what consumers are thinking about EVs. We've done a EV adoption research study the past 3 years, and every year it's been the same top barriers. So on this slide, you can see that the cost of the vehicle being too expensive is one of the top barriers. Lack of charging is next. And then the other three are about the battery. So the ability of the battery to hold the range, and then also the cost to replace the battery. And then once again, the cost of or the concern about the battery not being able to hold its charge. So as we think about as consumers come into the dealership and we're trying to help them decide which vehicle to buy and get more comfortable with EVs, think about some of these concerns that I'm talking about now. So these are the things that will have to be mitigated to really help the consumer want to buy an EV. Another thing that's going to be important to understand is the incentives. As you saw, cost price is the number one barrier. So it'll be important to really understand the incentives that are available. We recently had the Inflation Reduction Act. So there's now a $7,500 EV tax credit. And this is applicable now to all vehicle or OEMs. Last year, GM and Tesla weren't eligible because they had already sold 200,000 vehicles, but that cap's been eliminated. So now there's no limit, and the 7,500 will be available. There's also additional credits for mineral requirements and battery component requirements. This is where it gets a little bit confusing. Those are still, I think, the government's supposed to outline more specifics about that later this year. And then I think one of the things I'm really excited about is the used EV tax credit. So for the first time, we'll have that $4,000 tax credit, which will really, I think, help provide more accessibility to some of these EVs. And then one thing also to point out for the Inflation Reduction Act is that there are MSRP caps and income caps. So depending on if you're buying a sedan, if it's going to be under 55,000, it'll be eligible. And then if it's a SUV or truck, if it's 80,000 or below, it'll be eligible. So I think those will be important to really understand, like, what are those incentives? And then also, are you able to couple them with some state and local incentives? So when a consumer comes in, really be able to give them what that cost is going to be. Because as we know, EVs tend to be like I think it was $66,000 last year was the average EV price. So there's still a premium on EVs versus ICE. So I think the more you can paint that picture of what the cost will be really helpful to the consumer when they're coming in to buy an EV. Now let's talk a little bit about some findings that we had from our research in terms of what are expectations from customers on what a dealership should know when they're talking about electric vehicles. So you can see on this chart that consumers have very high expectations. They expect the dealer to talk about the different type of specs on the electric vehicle, the cost of ownership, have some variety to choose from, how to take care of them, how do they differ from the ICE. And then I think a key point too is helping them understand what kind of charging capability will be needed. And we'll talk a little bit at the end of this presentation of some specific things that will help to address some of these expectations. So now let's talk a little bit about when you're getting ready to sell EV, some of the things to think about. So this is from another piece of data from our research, and really to point out here, dealers are highly influential in converting EV shoppers into buyers. According to our research, you can see here the dealer remains an important part of the EV shopping journey, and a majority of those considering an EV visit a dealer showroom, most in person, and over 3 in 4 EV owners tell us that the dealer had some influence on their decision to purchase an EV. So just a reminder of how important it will be to arm your staff with the EV knowledge, education, and training to help the consumer along the buying journey, considering how influential the dealer is in this process. Now let's talk a little bit about the digital expectations of the consumers as they come in. So this is based on our research as well. But according to this research that you can see on here, over half of the EV buyers are considered heavy digital buyers. So that means that they complete the majority of their purchase online. And compare that to the 16% of all new vehicle buyers falling into the same category. So it's clear that digital retailing is essential to selling EVs. If there's one way to prioritize which shopping activities to provide EV buyers online, consider ability to calculate monthly payments, applying for credit, finalizing the purchase price, and selecting F&I products online. And while reviewing and signing paperwork digitally doesn't top their list, 40% of EV buyers are doing that online as too. So I think we all kind of learned from when COVID hit, every industry, but especially I feel like automotive dealerships, especially, were able to pivot quickly and really dive into this digital um, capability to offer their consumers. So, one of the thing about this as well is the changing demographics of EVs are tending to start to be more younger, multicultural, and so I think that really aligns well with becoming more digitally enabled at your dealership. So, just another key point and takeaway from this slide. Now let's move on to used EVs. I think that's going to be, in terms of mass adoption, I feel like that's going to be a critical piece of the story. So being able to sell a used EV when a consumer comes in, and I mentioned earlier the used EV incentive for the first time. So I think that's going to help. But a key part, I think, when a consumer comes in to buy an EV, used EV, they're going to want to know the battery health. As mentioned earlier, up to 45% of the value of a used EV is the battery. So I think having a diagnostic tool to really provide the health of that battery will be important when you're talking about the EV that you're selling. And at Cox, we're right now really in heavy R&D mode, looking at developing this capability to really take data from the battery, determine the health of it. As you can see on here, here's an example of something that we might really roll out into the industry is, and in this example, it shows a score from 1 to 5 and really shows what the battery range is now compared to when to new. And I think one of the things that'll be important as we get more and more data on used EV, we'll be able to really determine remaining useful life and also maybe show what kind of impact weather has on the range, driving behavior. So I think all these things will be important, and battery health is a key component. And I think we'll start to see more of that um, build trust and transparency in the marketplace. And then here's just another piece of data to show a proof point on that. In the survey that we did, we asked consumers would they be more likely to purchase a used EV if it had degradation, if it had a certificate. And so we're seeing that it jumped from 37 to 63%. And then another key piece on here is showing that by buying a used vehicle, you can save up to $20,000. So this also directly relates to the cost concern about consumers. So a used EV is going to be so important, and the ability to sell those are going to be very important. Now let's talk about building out EV infrastructure. This is a topic I know that can be very overwhelming. And I think one of the things is like the cost of it, how do I pay for it? So when you're thinking about building out your EV infrastructure, one of the key things is really identifying a partner. So whether it's a local utility or SME, an expert in this area, and helping to develop plan. Because one of the things you'll be able to really work out a plan with that um, utility or SME is what type of charging stations do you need? So level 2, level 3, where should they be placed? And then how much space will you need? I think those are really important things that you need to figure out. And especially once you have that plan, is really figuring out the cost. You know, average upfront cost of installing a single level 2 charger is about $6,000. So it can be quite costly. And you multiply that by the number that you need, it starts to add up. So one of the other things when you're developing that strategy for paying is look at what additional EV tax credits are available. There's some out there on the federal level that offset to about 30,000 of the cost of EV infrastructure. So I think that'll be something to really think about and plan as you start to figure out how do you pay for this and what's the ROI period for the EV infrastructure. And I think one of the other pieces about that, once you have that in, is how do you incorporate this infrastructure into the sales pitch strategy? So that being when a consumer comes in and is asking questions about charging infrastructure, you can show real time how to charge and show them how it works and how it operates. So I think that's going to be something important to build into your sales strategy. And then another thing I wanted to mention is that using analytics is going to be important as well. So once you have out this infrastructure for charging, really being able to figure out when's the best time to charge so that you don't incur additional electricity costs when you're charging on peak hours. So I think that's another thing to think about. And that could be something you work with the utility, figuring out how do you manage that and how do you track the charging infrastructure within your dealership. Now let's move on to some specific things, how to prepare yourself and the dealership to sell these EVs. So let's start with the in-store experience. I think one of the key things is having that um, in-store experience. So when you walk into the dealership, you see EV information. So whether it's signage, you actually have an EV in the showroom. I think that's going to be important. And then another thing I think is a good best practice is really something that you can engage the community. Have EV workshops, partner with a local nonprofit or even the utility and have a community event where you bring in an expert and you have different topics around EV. And that will be good to really not only educate your staff, but the community as well and start to build a brand about your dealership around EVs. So I think that's going to be important. And then let's move on to battery know-how. I think that's going to be important to really understand what type of battery is in the EV, what's the range, what's the lifetime of that battery, and the cost to replace will be important to be able to know. And then what happens at end of life. So those are some of the things that I think to prepare around knowing the battery know-how. And then in terms of charging know-how, being able to explain the different charging options, best practices, some of the things that are some of the practices that your staff should be able to talk about is when you're charging an EV, it's important not to do consistently fast charge an EV. It potentially could have impact on your battery. The other thing is never let it go down to 0 or 100% on a consistent basis as well. So those are some of the things in terms of really getting to get the consumer know how to charge and some of those best practices, and also being able to guide your consumer to some of the apps that are available to show where the charging stations are. So I think that's going to be important as well. And as you gather all that information on battery know-how and charging know-how, I think it's going to be able to really help you with that EV sales process. So really being able to highlight the EV value proposition, point out the high-tech features, being able to outline all the EV incentives that I mentioned earlier will be important as part of that in-store experience. And then, as I mentioned, the battery know-how, charging know-how, incorporating that into that sales process pitch. And then finally, I think key to all of it is getting the consumer behind the wheel. I'm not sure how many on who are listening in have driven or friends or families have driven an EV, but once you get in behind an EV, you experience it and you see how much fun it is to drive, especially considering the torque. It's a lot of fun. So I think that's going to be kind of one of the most critical things in that EV sales process. And then one last thing around that, I think it's going to be important to incorporating the charging as part of that experience. So letting them know kind of how that would feel and experience that firsthand will be, I think, really important to really close out that EV sales process. And then one of the other things, total cost of ownership, and this also relates to the cost barrier that we talked about earlier. So really being able to talk about EV versus ICE, vehicle depreciation. One of the other things is being able to talk about the charging cost. So depending on what state you're selling or you live in, what's that benefit of charging versus having to pay the utility or gas, I mean, pay for gas, what that differentiation is. And then also what is the maintenance schedule? I know there's a lot of talk about EVs have less parts, what's the maintenance going to be? So I think being able to talk about not only your staff, but the consumer about what's that schedule look like? What can they expect in terms of maintenance for their EV? And then finally, fixed ops. This is going to be key, is really making sure that your staff has all the safety measures in place. Anything that's important that you're going to need, whether it's vehicle lift safeties, gloves, goggles, anything that's going to be important to ensure that your staff is safe when they're interacting with these high voltage batteries. And then another key thing too, and I know some of the different manufacturers but ASE certification will be important as well. And I think once you start to get those in place, you're going to be able to build up that expertise and build that brand about a dealership being able to understand and maintain EV batteries. And that is it.
Stephanie, thanks so much for joining us today. What a great presentation. It's so relevant in today's world, and this is the future. It's coming. You will all be receiving a copy of this webinar by early next week. To those on the line, join us back here on Tuesday, March 28th at 2 p.m. Eastern as Citron talks supporting roles that can impact your top revenue generators. For more information about AIADA, visit aiada.org. Thanks for tuning in and have a great day, everyone.